Good afternoon and welcome to the Consensus Revenue Estimating Press Conference. The Revenue Group met earlier today and have revised last fall's estimates for fiscal year 24 and 25. So for fiscal year 2025, total SGF receipts estimate at $9.89 billion, which represents an increase of $157.9 million or 1.6% relative to the fall estimates. It's a decrease of $249.9 million or 2.5% relative to the final fiscal year 2024 actual receipts. For fiscal year 2026, the total receipt estimate is $10.066 billion, which represents an increase of $219.6 million or 2.2% relative to the fall estimate. There's an increase of $175.8 million or 1.8% relative to the newly revised fiscal 2025 estimate. The reoccurring theme throughout the forecasting cycle is an increased volatility in the state's economy. While that volatility unquestionably increases the uncertainty associated with the estimates, it doesn't necessarily reduce our expectations for the state's economy and the state's receipts. Many of the variables in the economy include substantial risks to both the upside and the downside. Changes to trade and fiscal policy at the federal level seem likely to have some impact on the state's economy. However, the magnitude and timing of the impact is unclear. Risks to the forecast include persistent elevated inflation, changes to trade policy, sustained high interest rates, and the potential for monetary policy impacts and geopolitical risks spanning the globe. The revisions to the estimates come after actual receipts had outpaced the previous estimate by over $200 million through March and largely captured the experience of receipts since those estimates were made in November. So for the economic forecast revisions for calendar year 2025, our estimate for inflation was increased from 2.3% to 2.9%. Our estimate for real Kansas GDP was decreased from 2.1% to 1.7%. And our estimate for nominal Kansas GDP was increased from 4.4% to 4.6%. For calendar year 2026, our estimate for inflation was increased from 2.2% to 2.5%. The estimate for real Kansas GDP was unchanged at 2%. And our estimate for nominal Kansas GDP was increased from 4.2% to 4.5%. So for employment through February, the jobs in Kansas had risen by 3,300 over the year, which represents a growth of 0.2%. The relative flat Kansas employment situation comes at a time when the nation as a whole is still seeing modest growth and is likely linked to the constrained labor supply as the Kansas labor force participation rate exceeds the pre-pandemic level, despite demographics that would work against that participation. Real hourly earnings have had a strong year of growth at 3.5% and are nearing the level they were prior to the high levels of inflation in 2021 and 2022. Nominal average hourly earnings for Kansas are up 6.7% year over year as of February, which is reflected in strong withholdings, which is driving individual income tax receipts. So for agriculture, in the agricultural sector, there's two major things that are happening. Crop producers are facing significant headwinds as prices for grain commodities have continued to decline without commensurate reductions in input prices. However, cattle prices are continuing to increase, and the economic experience of beef producers in the current climate is significantly different than the crop producers. Many cattle producers are indicating an interest in expanding their herds, the herd sizes, but high prices and demand for beef impose a supply chain difficulty for expansion. Additionally, dairy cattle production continues to expand. However, we still have a persistent drought. Although it's not as severe as it was this time last fall, it remains to be an obstacle for the entire agricultural sector, and the outcomes of trade upheaval pose both risks and potential rewards for the agricultural sector. So for oil and gas, the expectations for the energy sector have not substantially changed since the fall estimate. The price per barrel of Kansas crude was forecasted at $62 for fiscal year 2025, which is unchanged from the fall estimate, and $52 a barrel for 2026, which is down from $58 at the fall estimate. The long-term decline in oil production is expected to continue, but at a modestly lower rate during the forecast period. The price per 1,000 cubic feet of Kansas natural gas was forecast at $2.15 for 25 and $1.75 at the fall estimate, and $3.10 for 2026, up from $2.60 at the fall estimate. The forecasted production levels for natural gas are unchanged since the fall meeting and continue to reflect the long-run declines in production across the state. For manufacturing, the potential exposed to trade policy changes, the fallout of Kansas from China's recent announcement not to accept further deliveries from Boeing is not immediately clear what the impacts will be for that. However, the aviation sector has otherwise experienced several positive announcements in the Wichita area, and we also have the Panasonic plant anticipating to add manufacturing jobs throughout the forecast period, and the impact of those jobs is implicit within this forecast. However, overall manufacturing employment for the state is down by 2,900 over the year through February. For tax policy changes, as always, these estimates include the impacts of current law and the current interpretation. Accordingly, they fully incorporate tax legislation enacted during the regular session of the legislature that's been enacted into law. However, they do not incorporate tax bills that are currently on the governor's desk. These will be addressed in an adjustments memo to be published next month. They do not include any impact associated with speculated or proposed federal tax legislation. And a key uncertainty in these estimates is the timing of the impact associated with Senate Bill 1 from last year's 2024 special session, since much of that impact is materialized through income tax returns. The tax payments made this week by taxpayers will be key to understanding the ultimate impact of the legislation, and a clear picture of that impact is not yet available. With that, I want to thank everybody on all the meetings that we've had, particularly Adam. It's always a pleasure to work with you, and it's always good to work with all of the departments, the Department of Revenue, the Department of Agriculture, Pooled Money Investment Board, the economists from KU, K-State, and Wichita State, and all the many agencies that provide information for us to make these decisions. And with that, I will turn it over to Adam.
Thank you, Shirley. I appreciate that. I think you did a very nice job of summarizing all the discussion we've had over the past couple of weeks. As you all know, there are many parties that play a role in this and inform the decisions that we ultimately arrive at, and certainly want to echo Shirley's comments and notes of gratitude and appreciation for everybody's input. Certainly appreciate working with you and the insight that you bring, and the entire KLRD and Division of the Budget team. You know, I guess one of the words of the day, and Shirley touched on this, would be uncertainty as we look across the horizon, right? We're making the best possible estimate that we can, given all the potential headwinds that are out there and some of the policies that are shifting on a regular basis, but feel like we've arrived at a good forecast that can serve policymakers well over the next 18 months. With that, time's yours. Brad, if I can have you come to the mic, please. Can you come to the mic, please?
Yesterday, the Fed chair painted a rather grim picture of the economy, talked about increased inflation, slowing growth, and even the possibility of unemployment. Does any of this even touch on that? Because I don't hear the word stagflation or anything that has been talked about broadly in like the last 3 weeks, particularly since the tariff news broke.
I'll start and let Adam add some comments. The biggest issue there is we haven't seen what changes any of these possible things would do. So when we make our predictions, we have to go off what we know is going on currently. And there were discussions, but the fact that some of these things haven't happened and that they're predictions in the future, we didn't make our expectations from those possibilities.
Yeah, if I could add some color, you know, one of the things that the Chairman Powell referred to was some of the data points that he was looking at internally, and those data points, to my knowledge, have not yet been shared publicly. I don't know what those data points might be. They certainly weren't available to the revenue estimating group. That said, going back to my opening comments, you know, there's a lot of discussion around uncertainty. There's not a lot of consistency in federal policy right now, whether it's tariffs or anything else, so just not knowing exactly which economic levers might be pulled. We talked a lot about what could change, what the headwinds are and what the tailwinds are. Certainly recognize there are several potential headwinds, but to the extent that the Fed chair has data available to the Fed and not to us, it was not part of this forecast.
Do I need to identify myself?
That'd be helpful, please.
Okay. John Hanna with the Associated Press. So what are the biggest threats in terms of federal policy to this forecast? What's out there, if it happens, that could tank these numbers?
It could be any number of items. I mean, tariffs is the one that gets the headlines. You know, there's the big reciprocal tariffs or whatever they were that were announced, and then they were rolled back. There's still a baseline tariff of, I think, 10% across most countries, and then obviously the tariffs on China play a large role. Shirley touched on some of the decisions that have already been made in terms of aviation and maybe even the ag sector that could certainly impact. That's something we'll be watching closely over the next couple of months and seeing what the impacts might be. Maybe a lesser talked about, but certainly impactful one could be the decisions might be made on federal grants. There's a trickle down into the state. A lot of those grants come to the state. There's been a lot of talk about the education grants that are being rescinded, but there are a whole host of other grants that could have a flow-through effect. Employment levels are always a concern. We have our forecast for unemployment, and we have no need to deviate from these forecasts right now. These are our forecasts. But as things change, we'll continue to monitor, and we'll come back in November with more updated numbers. Shirley?
Thank you. I was going to echo what Adam said on a couple of those, and one is federal grants and unemployment with some of the federal positions because of the change in the grants. So.
Question is, it's mainly an employment issue, federal grants. That's certainly part of it. You know, a lot of positions are supported by federal grants. There's also a large regional headquarter on the Missouri side, but in the Kansas City area and federal employees across the state. But those grants have a ripple effect all the way through that isn't just at the direct beneficiary.
Carpenter and I work for the Kansas Reflector. Mr. Prophet, you know, a lot of the anxiety about the legislature leaving early was that bad news could occur today. And help me, I'm assuming this is relatively good news, that the revenue didn't crater. Am I right?
try to stay away from words like good and bad and just try to say up or down or, just more objective words. I don't think you heard me say any of those things that the bad news could happen here, but point well taken. The forecast is increased for the current year and for the, for the budget year. And if you look at fiscal 25, as Shirley mentioned, we're up by about $200 million year to date in fiscal 25. We're increasing the forecast by $157.9 million total receipts. So that would suggest that we're going to give back some of the increases that we've experienced over the past couple of months, due mostly to timing. And as she alluded to, we're still trying to figure out the totality of the impact of special session Senate Bill 1 and the timing of that impact. When the profile gets handed out, we might have more discussion on what that might look like, but there are still concerns over the long run with our fiscal situation.
Technical question on Senate Bill 1. It's been, 9 months since that passed? Why would we not have an idea of the timing? What makes that of tax revenues? What makes that so uncertain?
So I think we still believe in the fiscal impact and the fiscal note that was published last summer for special session Senate Bill 1. The reality is, because it is an income tax, largely an income tax bill, it is going to play itself out as tax returns are filed. Also, because it was retroactive to be full, in effect for full fiscal year 24, you had at least half of the calendar year 24, you had half of the year where the tax cut was not in place, but we were still collecting at a certain rate. So as tax returns are finalized, it's having a pretty substantial impact on the number of refunds and the size of refunds, as well as the number of balance due payments and the size of balance due payments that are coming in. So it's just a matter of getting all the mail in and having revenue have the time to go through each of those parcels of mail to see what the impact is going to be. But we still believe in the fiscal note that was published last summer.
Carpenter again of the Kansas Reflector. So you think in a month or two you'll have a handle on this? There was a mention of a revised report.
The revised report that was mentioned is there are other pieces of tax legislation that are pending, and those will be, as we do every year, we publish an adjusted for legislation, and that will be the only change there. But yes, we should have a better handle on the impact of the Senate Bill 1 mostly by the end of May. There are some late filers that extend all the way to October.
Sunflower State Journal. Pivoting to Senate Bill 269, based on these numbers that you're looking at in terms of income tax receipts, when do you guys have an idea or a forecast of when the triggers on 269 kick in based on these numbers?
Based on the forecasts that are here, if these forecasts were to come to fruition and we hit the forecast exactly, it appears unlikely that the first trigger would be hit. We don't have a forecast out there for the first year in which the trigger would be pulled. It's not part of this forecast. We forecasted through fiscal 26, and we'll have to revisit the out years. But with these forecasts, it appears unlikely that it would be triggered through fiscal 26.
I'm curious about that, John Hanna with AP again. I'm curious about that. Is that because revenues would not grow past the rate of inflation?
Without getting too technical and explaining calculations here, the short answer is it appears unlikely. Based on these forecasts would not exceed the inflation-adjusted baseline in fiscal 26.
I'm kind of curious, a very, very, very technical question here. You have net transfers under the other revenues line, and they appear from fiscal 25 to fiscal 26, they're appearing to drop quite a bit. We're doing less transfers. Am I reading that right? We go from a revised estimate of 346.3 million down to 286.
Correct.
which is down from 378 the year before. What are we transferring less of?
Yeah, so the main driver of that, John, is the Build Kansas transfer that was authorized last year, 2 years ago, was authorized for a number of fiscal years. The legislature has suspended that transfer in fiscal '26. So it shows up as an increase in revenues for fiscal '26, effectively as a one-time event. But thank you for reading the details of the table. There is. So you should have in front of you the profile as prepared graciously by KLRD. Again, takes into account the revenue adjustments that we've made today for both fiscal '25 and fiscal '26. There are some growth percentages that have been applied to the out years, which aren't yet officially agreed to, but are largely in line with what you might expect to see in the out years before the next fiscal revenue forecast. Also got expenditures to reflect legislative activity throughout the year. So you have total expenditures, and then you have the ending balance there on line 21. So in fiscal '25, we're projecting an ending balance of $2.29 billion SGF. In fiscal '26, again, with the updated revenue forecast and expenditures approved by the legislature, we're looking at $1.735 billion at the end of fiscal '26. I'm assuming there will be a question on this, so I'll just address it now and be ahead of it. If you keep sliding your finger to the right on that line, obviously that number shrinks dramatically to the extent that it has red in parentheses, and we're negative $730 million in fiscal '29. Again, that's just a forecast based on some growth factors and some estimates, but to me, the line that I generally look at is the receipts above or below expenditures, the very bottom line. You can see that in fiscal '25, we are overspending our receipts by $930 million. And in fiscal '26, we're overspending by $555 million, and this is just SGF. And if you look across time, we're structurally imbalanced by $831 million. So the ending balance is eroding rather rapidly based on the forecast that we provided today. If you could come to the mic, please.
Hannah with AP again. Is that largely a function of tax cuts that the legislature has approved, some with the governor's signature, some not?
I don't think you can point to any one thing. I think there is obviously tax cuts to the extent that you reduce taxes, that reduces revenue source for the state, so it does bring down revenues. Expenditures are obviously going up as well, so you have to look at both sides of the equation. But yes, expenditures are far in excess of anticipated revenues over the next couple of years. And
I mean, these out-year numbers recall the Brownback administration pretty vividly.
we are structurally imbalanced. There are no two ways about it. The ending balance is eroding rather rapidly. As a budget director, I'm speaking as a budget director today, right now, not as a revenue estimating guy. That gives me concern. So it's something that needs to be addressed and something that we've been looking at for some time.
Cooper again, real quick question on fiscal 28. It shows 63.2 in the black, the budget that was passed, and I just want to know what the change is. Originally, the budget profile that accompanied the budget had that number at about 460 million and change. What changed for fiscal 28 in this profile versus what was attached or accompanied the budget that was approved?
So I think you said that, and again, this isn't my work, and so I'm going to try to speak to it as best I can. The one that was attached to the final budget bill showed a negative $407 million, I believe. So this is an improvement relative to the one that was attached to the budget profile. And it's driven purely, I would say, by the increase in revenues. When we increase the fiscal 26 revenue forecast, largely that carries forward and compounds year over year. Now, this year is a little bit unique in as much as a lot more, about half of the fiscal 26 increase, as John pointed out, is tied to a reduction in transfers, which is a one-time event, and increased interest earnings, so it's not all taxes. But the short answer is, with increased revenues, the end imbalance improves in the out years, although still, yeah, it was negative 460 something. 63 million is still low. Yes.
Jason Outletted, Topeka Capital Journal. Structural imbalance seems to be the term. Looking at the receipts compared to the spending, it's roughly $800 million below. What does the legislature, the budget office, the governor need to do to address that imbalance?
Well, to me, the simple answer, and this is going to be too simple, is increase revenue and decrease expenditures, which I know the legislature had, that was part of their message this last session.
Yeah, from the budget office perspective, I mean, this is something we've been watching for a couple of years now. I think the governor's been pretty consistent in her message that we need to be showing fiscal restraint and making sure that we have a good handle on expenditures and don't grow them unnecessarily. And while she's been a champion of tax cuts in years past, we need to be mindful of what the price tag is so we don't find ourselves underwater.
If the solution is to decrease expenditures, how much does it need to decrease by? Is it in the ballpark of $800 million a year?
I don't think we can, I'm speaking again for the budget office. I'm not going to assign a number to it today. I mean, when we look at the structural imbalance of negative $831 million, clearly that's an issue. You can sustain that for a year or two, but you cannot sustain that in perpetuity, which is what's happening. So the reality is we need to get more structurally balanced. We need to find the right way to do that, and that takes a lot of time, thought, and effort, and really, really critical thinking and analyzing at a very deep level of how to do that. So we'll have to work on that over the next several months.
Is it an issue for the next legislative session to handle, or would the governor consider calling a special session to address it?
I don't think I'd be prepared to answer that question right now.
John Hanna with AP again. Shirley, you talked about, both of you have talked about the volatility of the economy, the uncertainty about federal policy. Is this a situation where this picture could look pretty different next month or the month after, or what is the time horizon for seeing a picture that might be radically different?
To be honest, I can't answer that at this time because I don't know what decisions are going to be made in the future and how far into the future they're made and how that's going to affect the Kansas economy. I have no crystal ball at this point. Did you have anything else?
Have you ever been in quite the same position as someone who's dealt with these fiscal issues for a while? Has it ever been quite this volatile in terms of policy and what to expect?
I think that's relative to different situations. I can't say that what's going on right now has ever happened before, but other things have happened. There's been other volatility. It's all relative.
Yeah, volatility is part of forecasting and the economy, right? I mean, COVID was a very volatile time, both up and down. The 08, 09 recession was a volatile time as well. I think the difference here is strategy appears to be changing on a daily basis, if not weekly, so it's hard to get a handle on exactly what the impact might be or for how long it might be in place. So again, going back to some of our opening comments, we discussed all of this. We recognize there are potential headwinds out there. We recognize there is volatility. We feel confident that this is a forecast that needs to be put in place of policymakers and make the best decisions possible, while also recognizing that there are considerable headwinds that we need to be mindful of as we move forward. Probably time for a couple of more, guys.
seeing that revenue was revised upward this time around, is it possible, or how likely is it that revenue estimates could continue to beat that actual revenue collections could beat estimates to the point that those red numbers in the out years turn into black numbers by the next time we are all meeting here?
We'll tell you in July. Sorry, I'm not trying to be flippant. The reality is this is the forecast that we put in place, and our hope is that we come within 1% of this, right? I mean, that's the way we approach this, is try to make the best estimate possible. Maybe one more, max, or 0. All right, thank you all. Have a great weekend.
All right, yes, thank you.